Supercomputing is becoming an essential tool of scientific and medical research. Operating award-winning data centres, KO Data is proud to host Cambridge One, the UK's most powerful supercomputer accelerating health research. With computing power and space available and excellent connectivity to Cambridge and the cloud, KO Data is ideally placed to support advanced computing organisations of all shapes and sizes. Get in touch today at kodata.com/contact. Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Faye.
So, Faye, I haven't seen you for a while. How has your week been?
I know, it's like we see each other loads and then don't see each other for a while, but I'm sure we'll rectify that next week for a variety, and the week after, and actually possibly the week after.
There's no escape.
so you'll be really happy you haven't seen me for a little while then, so that's good. Yeah. Hey, do you know what? So it's 37, 36 days or something. Oh, someone will correct me anyway. But yeah, it's definitely in the 30s now till Christmas, which is exciting. Anyway, you asked me, sorry, I think I've just gone off on a tangent. This week, so loads of exciting stuff. Did some work with Cambridge Science Centre. At the start of the week, a lot of the week has been taken up with me wearing my Cambridgeshire Chambers of Commerce hat. We have a big event this coming week on Wednesday, the 22nd, at Imperial War Museum in Duxford, which is the CAMS B2B event. So that's taken up quite a lot of the week. A couple of pieces of work for the entrepreneurial programs in Cambridge through the university. And I've been in your gaff as well. So you haven't seen me, but I've actually been in the Bradfield Centre working with Mark and Chris Watson on planning for 21 to Watch, which is going to be in the Bradfield Centre next year on the 7th of March. Did you know that?
I think I did know that. Yeah. Let's celebrate that again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we planned that behind your back anyway, so I'm sure you won't mind.
Yeah, I've had a really interesting week as well. Kind of bit of everything. So we had the reboot of the Software Crafters Cambridge meetup at the Bradfield, which is really nice. Great to see those kind of communities coming back after the disruption of COVID. And on the theme of events, we had our first Trinity Bradfield Prize workshop on Wednesday night at Trinity College. Friend of the show, Lucy Young from Charcoal, was one of the panelists, and also Steve Marsh from Geospock. And Steve is working on something in stealth, and I've already nobbled him to come onto the podcast, so look out for that in the new year.
Good.
And then last but by no means least, my daughter graduated on Tuesday. So we were down in London to celebrate that. So very proud parents.
Wow. And what did she read?
Marketing and Communications.
Superb. Shall we move on with the news then?
Yeah, let's do that. What's been happening in Cambridge this week?
Well, let's start with some unconfirmed news. So we're not gossiping here. We have actually been provided this piece of information. And this news is on Pragmatic. And you'll know Pragmatic, Cambridge company revolutionising the semiconductor industry. It has been reported that they're set to reap a whopping £200 million in new funding this month from M&G's Catalyst Fund and Saudi Aramco's investment arm. So Sky News broke the story, Bloomberg followed up, but Pragmatic declined to comment when they were approached by Business Weekly. But if it is true, the whole will more than double their investment pile to date, which stands at around 190 million. And bearing in mind that the big amount of that was a Series C of 125 million in December last year, so like almost 12 months ago. So this is like a huge game changer if that is actually coming true. So we'll hopefully find out for accuracy in the coming days. And they've also hired a semiconductor industry veteran, Shane Geary, as Senior Vice President of Manufacturing and Operations. So they're definitely continuing to be on the up.
No, that's really exciting. And also news coming out of another well-known Cambridge scale-up, Bolt, who are pioneering the development of ultra-fast charging batteries. This week, they've launched an advanced battery technology to be rolled out as an electric vehicle mobile DC supercharger, which can deliver up to 300 kilowatts DC charge. That sounds like it could really kind of close a gap in the infrastructure that's necessary for EV vehicles to be widely adopted. So that's really interesting. And Nyobolt also developed an EV themselves called Bolt E, which can be recharged in 6 minutes and has a battery life of over 10,000 charging cycles.
Very impressive. So, should we move on then to today's episode? We sat down with Oriane Chausiaux and Shamus Husheer, two of the co-founders from Heartfelt Technologies, and we talked to them about their entrepreneurial journey, about funding, and about the problem that they're tackling. So let's find out more. So welcome, Oriane and Shamus. It's great to have you with us today. Why don't you just introduce yourselves?
I'm Dr. Shamus Husheer. I'm the co-founder of Heartfelt Technologies. I came to Cambridge in 2002 to start my PhD in nuclear and structural chemistry, and I forgot to go home, so please don't tell the Home Secretary. Seriously though, Oriane and I met whilst I was studiously avoiding my PhD, and a group of us won the university business competition for a remote patient monitoring company. That company was based on infertility, and there was a group of us students that won a prize from the local investment community, who then went on to back us multiple times to fund that company. Eventually that company was taken over by a venture fund which came with its own management. Life got a little bit boring for the scientific founders, as is often the case. We moved on and started another company together because we had so much fun doing the first one. Ups and downs of entrepreneurship as they are, it's actually, overall it's really quite fun.
Yeah.
And you can also make a meaningful impact.
So that's great, and loads of things to unpick there, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Oriane.
Hi, I'm Dr. Oriane Chausiaux, if I want the full title. But so I'm French, also came a year after Shamus to Cambridge. I did an Erasmus exchange program. And yes, the story then follows what Shamus just said. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for the business.
That's great. So before we actually go into Heartfelt Technologies, let's start with, why did Heartfelt Technologies come about? What's the issue that you're trying to address?
So heart failure is a chronic condition. It affects a lot of people, typically elderly patients. The NHS spends $2 billion on that every year. The majority of that cost is linked with hospitalisation, and most of these hospitalizations are preventable. And most of these patients that get hospitalised are what clinicians call non-adherent patient or non-compliant patient. I think it's really important at that point to say that these patients are not refusing the healthcare. They're not on purpose avoiding what they're supposed to be doing. They might have dementia, they might have comorbidity, which makes it really difficult for them to follow the regimen they're supposed to be following. And so we were having a conversation at a friend's birthday party with a cardiologist who was having a frank conversation, I think is the polite way of putting that, with us, and explaining what the problem was with a lot of his patients, and saying, if only they told me that their ankles were swelling, they wouldn't be here. They wouldn't be so unwell. They wouldn't be blocking beds in the NHS, etc., etc. And Shamus came up with an idea on the spot and went in the kids' bedroom to crayon it.
I should point out, this was the third bottle of wine down with the cardiologist. And as Oriane says, he was being very forthright about the issues as a surgeon, chopping people open, putting pacemakers and implants into them, and the amount of what was, in his view, unnecessary surgical procedures for people who, and this is classic for clinicians, who they feel just aren't following the instructions. And, quite rightly, the clinicians are frustrated by this. But when you delve deeper into this, there's really good reasons why these people aren't following instructions. They're simply overburdened most of the time. But about the third bottle of wine down, knowing that we were looking for our next thing, I was like, hold on, I can solve that for you. As I say, my PhD was in instrumentation design, so I could immediately see an application of imaging technology to this. And it just about I think 9 months before this conversation, there was a large change in the way that neural networks were being trained for image processing. So you'd literally gone from impossible to do certain image recognition and processing tasks to feasible on a great big GPU and desktop. But myself and our third co-founder, who did his PhD research in image processing here in Cambridge, we'd been sort of following what was going on with that, him to a greater extent than myself. But we knew that this might be possible. So sketched out, literally with the kids' felt tip pens, a very rough plan of what one could do to solve this. And it's almost the same as the patent that we filed about 3 months later, which then eventually granted with these amazingly broad claims, because we just happened to be very early into this field of, the change from impossible to possible, and applying this to a specific niche in the medical marketplace that other people hadn't considered at that time.
That's a very Cambridge story, isn't it? Being at a party and having the right conversation at the right time. So Heartfelt Tech, you're looking then at both the actual medical device and also then the AI and the software that interprets and analyzes and produces the data.
Oh yes, the actual hardware. If someone could go and steal our hardware, replicate it, and sell it on the market at half the price, we would love them for it, because all that we want to do is run the software that is necessary to do this analysis. The hardware is a means to an end. Now, most of the hardware that we have is off-the-shelf devices. In fact, our very first prototype was a massive bank of Raspberry Pis, also straight out of Cambridge, all arranged in a particular physical arrangement, so all these cameras pointed at the same spot, and that spooled great wads of data off to a PC that had to be processed manually at the start. Then we moved on to a bastardized version of the Microsoft Kinect Xbox sensor. We literally rewrote the firmware for this, hacked the connectors so that we could put it onto a PC with a graphics card on, and we were sticking boxes with these things in patients' homes. We got this game controller through CE marking as a medical device. Oriane's just brilliant at going through the regulatory paperwork for these things. And that allowed us to collect decent amounts of data that we could use to train neural networks in the way that we needed, because it's not like there was a great data set publicly available of people's feet as they have heart failure. Right? We had to go and get all this right from scratch and train networks from scratch on this.
So how many images has it taken to get the model to a point where it's reliable?
We were very early into what is now very trendy, which is sort of data simulation and synthetic data. We just didn't have any data, and necessity being the mother of invention, we used a cartoonist's tool, 3D animation tool, to fake lots of anatomical data using cartoon almost body models, and then applying the correct statistical noise from the sensors and things like that over it, in order to generate data that was good enough to train the very first models. And you could get the requisite hundreds of thousands to millions of images out of that. And that was good enough to get the thing working to a stage where we could then collect real patient data. And then you can use a technique called transfer learning, where you sort of just modify the network a little bit with the data that's really precious. In medical work, you've always got a shortage of actual patient data. And then we could get that working with the patient data, and absolutely worked as we hoped that it would, with, at the time, only thousands of real images coming out. And now, of course, we have, I think it was, a third of a petabyte or something like that of data that we've got. An enormous amount we've collected now. And so we've got far more data for training than we actually need now, which is great, because you can then set up all sorts of statistical methods to be selective to ensure that you've got balanced data sets, and even relatively unusual or rare features, you can ensure that they have decent representation, and this helps training your models, all sorts of good things like that.
And just so listeners can visualize it, the device itself, is it a wearable? It's something where you have to
install it in the bedroom, just by the side of the bed, which is slightly controversial, but we can get to that in a minute.
Okay.
The reason we chose that place is because patients go in and out of bed relatively reliably, right? They might even go to the toilet several times during the night if they take their diuretics, so we're going to get more data at that point. So we install it, it's simply attached to the wall or near the wall, and it's plugged in, and it doesn't touch the patient. It's all using 3D imaging technology.
Okay.
So the patient doesn't have to remember to do anything. And that's really important. If I come back to my non-adherent, non-compliant patient, you don't want to make them use an app, wear a wearable. They're going to forget it.
That's really
After a few weeks, it's just not going to be done anymore. And that's the problem. That's why these guys are in and out of hospital again and again and again.
So anytime there's movement, it takes an image.
So every time there is movement, the device is going to look for the features of a feet. And so initially it was not very good at that. We did have quite a range of things coming up on the images. But over time, as we train the models better and better, we now have just human feet on there. And then it is learning to recognize the patient against other carers or other people in the house.
Okay.
So we could selectively take the measurements from that person as opposed to the whole family, which would be meaningless.
Really interesting.
So the idea is they're being tracked much more regularly.
That's right.
I mean, how would they be tracked if they didn't have this?
So the standard care in the UK is patients are asked to weigh themselves every day and to report a change in weight of about 1.5 kilos or so over several days. That's all well and good if you are able to remember to step on those scales and to interpret the results yourself and remember what it was yesterday or remember to note it down. These guys don't remember to do that and can't do that reliably. So we did several studies and pretty much overall we are looking at about 3 times per month people will measure themselves on the weighing scales. That's clearly not enough.
About a third of patients over a year-long clinical study don't step on the scales once, even when they're told by the doctor, this is, potentially life-saving, just track if your weight shoots up.
They just can't.
They just can't. And weight, although it's quite a good clinical indicator, not the best, but, it's a convenient thing to measure, there's a large population of patients who have psychological associations of weight with their lives. These are patients often who have had weight management problems through their lives, often self-esteem issues as a result, and have been told repeatedly, you have to lose weight, you have to lose. So they don't have a positive association with something that they're then told is medically necessary for them to do. So you're starting from a sort of a low baseline of acceptance there. There are other devices that are given to these patients, wearable blood pressure cuffs, right? But you don't wear them all the time. You have to remember to wear them. There are some devices, smartwatches, for example, that can get some associated parameters about these conditions. But the reality is that even Fitbit, I think when they filed for an IPO, they had to disclose that something like the median wearer of a Fitbit used it for 90 days before it was then just left discharged in a drawer. These are people trying to, they're young, fit, exercising people, right? And they are stopping charging and wearing these wearables. The Apple Watches, because, of the additional functionality the watch brings to you, checking your email and so on, people tend to engage with those a little better, longer term. But if you're not engaging with it for that extra functionality, if you're just using it as some sort of tracker, then adherence drops straight back down to like a Fitbit.
And let's remember, these patients are in their 80s, so they're not as email focused as a lot of the younger patients might be. But if I just come back to the comparison that, we were talking about earlier, so standard care, we get 3 days for the patients who do weigh themselves. If we compare with the data we're getting, is about 23 days per month's worth of data.
Even the ones who don't weigh themselves at all.
That's right. So the clinicians then have data they can work with. They can look at their data, they can look at trends, and they can decide, that patient needs to have slightly more diuretics because they're not coping as it is.
And so the clinicians have got that platform, they've got the access, and there's a trigger or something?
They do. So this is another challenge in the NHS at the moment. The GPs are the ones supposed to be looking after these patients. They were incredibly busy. It's very difficult to get an appointment. So in theory, you have about 10 to 15 days by the point an alert is raised before the patient is hospitalised, which should be plenty of time. We all know that's difficult to get a GP appointment at the moment, so they can't all do that. However, the good news is these patients have been prescribed the diuretics at home, and in the majority of cases, the reason why their feet are swelling is because they forgot to take the diuretics. So a simple phone call from either us or one of their relatives, carers, can solve that problem. Just reminding Granny, did you take your medication yesterday? Go and check the pill box, please. No, you didn't. All right, well, make sure you take it and you don't forget it for the next 2 days, because otherwise we know what happens. You'll end up in hospital.
I should point out here that obviously if we could just remind patients all the time to take their pills, then we wouldn't have a business. But the reality is that there's been academic study after academic study trying to do, and products on the market, trying to do reminder type apps for these patients. And people get what's called reminder blindness. So that this works for a period of time. There's lots of studies that show wonderful 30-day improvements in people's use of pills and medication with such devices and apps and so on. But by 1 year later, they're right straight back down to baseline. These patients living with this condition, typically for the rest of their lives, often 5 years, I think the median is after diagnosis. So you can't just come up with solutions that work for a 30-day trial and, go, wow, we got that, publish it and move on. This has got to be something that works with people as often, sadly, their capability to adhere worsens and worsens and worsens. And their probability and the risk of further hospitalizations increases throughout that time. So really the benefit that you're trying to get out of such technology, it becomes more and more important as they become less and less adherent to that advice.
Fascinating. I'm thinking while you're talking about these devices that remind you of things, I put one on my phone, which is you have to stand up, because I sit down working most of the time and it's like it beats me when I have to stand up, but except it really annoys me. So, and I spoke to an ex-colleague and he's like, well, why are you even doing that? Because you're just going to ignore it. You're not going to have an app telling you what to do, are you, Faye? And there's a little bit of that, isn't there? There's that human behavior you're trying to get. So I want to pick up, Oriane, back to one of your points. You said it can be a little bit controversial putting it next to the bed. Why would that be? Because that seems to be very logical.
Well, it seems very logical, but if you think about how the device works, it takes images. And so obviously taking images in somebody's bedroom can be a bit controversial.
Right.
So we've had to work with patients, their carers, obviously clinicians as well, to make sure that what we were doing was acceptable. So we've put in place some measures to ensure that privacy was respected. So for example, the camera is pointing downwards a little bit. So we're focusing on the feet, nothing else. We are censoring images 40 centimeters from the floor. So you don't even see the knees, basically, of the patients. And so interestingly, that comes up in quite a lot of the conversation with the nurses and the clinicians, is to say, is it ethical to do this? Right. But when we talk to patients, they're absolutely fine. I mean, some of them want to see on, if we show them on a screen, this is the type of data we would get when you are standing here. Look, this is what it looks like. They get quite excited. They think that's very nice that somebody's looking after them and can be there for you if that's needed. But
we've got a device where we're running an AI on the front end looking at every image that comes off in a video stream. So it's constantly running. It's not that it's movement detected or something like that. It's constantly streaming this data through an AI. And the job of that AI is to recognize people's feet, which also means that it can do a partial job, not a complete job, of separating everything that's not a foot out of that. And then you take the data that passes through that filter effectively in mathematical terms that's been partially censored, pass it to the next stage in the pipeline and so forth. And you can, as you pass it along that pipeline, you eventually end up with only the pixels that are on people's feet getting used in the final steps of processing. The further you can move that computation to the edge, to the device, obviously it has privacy benefits for the patient, but there's an economic benefit for us as the company in doing so, in that our server costs are smaller, our bandwidth costs are smaller, and so on. So it's this really nice virtuous circle here with improving quality of data that we capture, improving the training of the AI. We have a financial incentive to improve privacy, right? And obviously the patients want that. Well, the patients, as Oriane says, often don't really express an opinion. The clinicians, the nurses, and the families of the patients want that. You hear a lot of debate about AI and privacy and so forth. Often commercial companies have a perverse incentive when it comes to privacy in the AI field. I think this is an excellent example of where a company can have a very positive, aligned incentive with privacy.
You referenced some NHS data in describing the size of the problem. My understanding is the NHS is quite a complex organisation to deal with. So where are you right now in terms of piloting or trialling the service and the device, and what does that process look like?
So we've had 5 clinical studies in the NHS across, I think it's now dozens of sites have been involved in that, including a small randomized controlled study, which is sort of the gold standard of clinical trials. We have had pilots with many GP groups, including one of the largest GP chains in the country, where they've just given this device to their patients, allowed us to monitor them. And because GPs are very overloaded, this has allowed the GPs to essentially have less of their time used up monitoring these patients. And they hear from them when, our system raises an alert. This minimizes the amount of GP time needed for what are, as far as the health system is concerned, quite burdensome patients. And the GPs can spend that time having, more meaningful conversations with patients, all the different types of patients they have, rather than just being like, come on, remember your pills. So it really helps there in the NHS. Clinical trial results have been really good. We've shown that it's better than the gold standard of measuring the volume of the foot, and it's as good as having a research nurse sitting in your bedroom checking for the worsening of edema. So it works wonderfully. But to your point, the NHS is a Byzantine organisation to work with commercially. We haven't yet commercialised in the NHS. We've had partnerships with all of these different parts of the NHS to do trials where we get to get the data that we need, and we give the product to the NHS for free, and we monitor these patients entirely at our cost. But that allows us to build up that crucial data for training the AI systems and to collect the clinical data to show that it works.
So are you focusing on the UK, or are you working internationally in parallel to that as well?
As Shamus mentioned, the NHS is a little bit tricky to commercialise into. The US is the big market, and that's where I guess most of our focus is going to be in the coming years. The other advantage of the US is from a clinical trial point of view. They have clever ways we could use to reduce the cost of a clinical trial. So if we were to do a 1,500 patient study, which is roughly what we would need to do to demonstrate a reduction in hospitalisation, which is what NICE in the UK would want to see, it would take 3 to 5 years in the UK to do that. By the time hospitals have time to recruit patients into it and we monitor them, etc., etc. In the US, we have found potential partners to run such a study, and they're called remote patient monitoring companies. They are paid by Medicare to monitor these chronically ill patients, and they have a direct incentive to use our device because we collect much more data, which means they can get paid for the work that they're doing. So they're very excited to work with us on the clinical trial over there. We've just been having conversation with FDA and Medicare on the protocol to make sure that they're happy with what we're proposing. That's going very well, so that's brilliant. And so I think the focus will have to be US first to capture that data quicker, but then we will have to do a smaller study, maybe let's say 200 to 300 patients in the UK, to validate the results here, because obviously they're very different healthcare systems. So what works with American cardiologists may not work with UK GPs and cardiologists.
Right.
So we need to demonstrate that. So that's the plan.
Fascinating stuff, and it kind of seems like a totally logical thing. It's good for the healthcare service, it's good for the patients, it saves money. I mean, there's so many positives about it, so it's really exciting. Thank you for sharing that technology side of it and the business side of it. What I would like to do now is talk a little bit about your experiences. As you said, this isn't your first rodeo, you've been here before. So what are your experiences of setting up this business, of running it, of getting funding? What's that journey been like?
So as I said, we were actively looking for the next opportunity when we became board in our last company. Once we spotted this, we were reviewing a number of different ideas that we were looking to work on, but we knew that we wanted to work together. This one matched elements of all of our skill sets, so it seemed like a good idea. And the thing that really pushed us onto this business was a patent search that was done. We had a number of other opportunities we were looking at, and as is usually the case when you're looking at the patent landscape for a new idea, is your idea patentable? Yes, but. With this one, the patent attorneys came back to us and they were like, guys, file something as quickly as goddamn possible. This is amazing. And, you don't know what's behind you by about a 12-month window, because publications of patents take time. But this advance that had been made in deep learning was I think, less than 12 months behind us at the point that we filed. So we were like, okay, maybe there will be stuff coming out. 12 months later, it was very clear that wasn't the case. And we got these fantastic claims granted in Europe and the US. It's brilliant. And so that's what pushed us to jump onto this. We went back to the shareholders of our previous business and said, hey, you guys know us. There's no obligation to work with us again. You don't have any rights over our new company and ideas. Investors buy your company. They don't buy you. But because we had a good relationship with many of those investors, we said, hey, here's the new idea. At the time, we needed a little bit of money to match a small grant. Can we, ask you guys to match what we needed? And 48 hours later, we had more than twice as much money offered as we were asking for. So that has to have been the easiest fundraising round I've ever done in my life. And we were like, okay, well, I guess we have a business now. So then we went through all of the process that, again, second, third time around, much easier to do because we knew exactly how to set up a business. We had, for example, because Oriane's on the ball on these things, we'd been using a ISO 13485 accredited method of writing down all of our ideas and development before the company was even founded. That meant that we ended up getting a CE mark, I think it was 4 months after the business was incorporated. Now, legally, you need to have been sitting under a quality management system for 6 months before you can get a CE mark, right? So this was faster than legally possible, other than that we could provide all of this evidence that all the earlier development before incorporation of the company had been done on, meeting all the regulatory requirements. Yeah, these are things that I guess the first time around you would never even consider doing.
But it was the same way as, we knew which lawyers we wanted to work with, which accountants we wanted to work with. All of these things were so much faster to set up because we had done it before. We already had a lot of contacts in Cambridge and elsewhere to help us with that. So
has that reputation helped with building the team as you start to scale the business?
So we've been very careful on team size. One of the lessons that we learned from our last business is we're scientists, we're technical people. We are not necessarily amazing managers. We know how to work with people who do our sort of thing, but we got up to a size of about 30 people in our last company that we were trying to manage ourselves.
That's hard. It's really hard.
When you have to juggle holiday calendars for 30 people, that's not really what any of us got into business for. And so we looked at this. We knew exactly what we needed to build and how. And there's this idea, particularly in technical development, that your technical development progresses at the square root of the number of people in your team. So, one person does 1 unit of work. 4 people does 2 units of work, right? 9 people does 3 units of work. So it becomes very inefficient as you add people. And so we've chosen to have a team structure where we are very orthogonal. We have very separate skill sets. We don't step on each other's toes. And we have pretty well-defined demarcations between team members. And that means that when we've added team members over time, we've been very careful about who we add and precisely what they're doing. And we've tried to minimize the amount of, if you like, HR overhead in that process. So the people that we hire are very self-motivated, self-starting individuals. We worked remote years before it was trendy. The pandemic came along and it was like, oh, okay, we're doing the same as everyone's been doing now, but we're going to do it more. So, that's kind of how we worked anyway. And this worked very, very well for us. Yeah, scaling the team has been much, much more of a cautious, thought-through, methodical process this time around, whereas last time it was like, oh, crap, we need extra work doing, hire people to do it. And that turned out not to be the best way of building a team. We did get fantastic high-quality people in our previous company.
We were just lucky.
Yeah. Several of them have come to work in our new company. But yeah, that was down much more to good luck than good management, whereas now it's very much more methodical process.
It's grown up a little bit.
Well, it's an experience, isn't it, knowing how it works for you and being efficient. I want to come back to your comment about funding was really easy. It was the easiest funding round, the first one you did. It's been difficult out there. How is it now, funding?
Oh, yes. So we're probably a great example of a company that's had absolutely no issues raising funding right up through the pandemic. Then early 2022, with the best timing in the world, we went out for a large VC fundraise to cover this very large clinical trial that we knew we would need to do. And I think we went out to the market in February 2022 with that. And by March 2022, it was very clear that we were pitching a 2021 business, and the market was very different. A huge number of VC investors were sitting on their hands, and it's perfectly logical, right? These people are making 10-year-long bets. Why would they make a 10-year-long bet in a year that a war starts, in a year that inflation hits? You would just sit there and wait to see whether this is a temporary thing, whether this is going to be a long-term thing, right? You wouldn't place 10-year bets in that environment. Terrible for the startups that are after that funding, of course, but perfectly logical for the investors. And as a startup, the investor doesn't have to invest in you. You have to understand what their needs are. So by about the middle of 2022, we looked around and we're like, okay, this is an environment that's not going away anytime soon, and we need to be funded differently. So like many people over the last year or so, we were possibly slightly earlier to it than many. We just sat down and turned the company into a grant writing machine. We've been extremely successful with that because, a high-quality company that never had problems at raising investment, market changes, you jump into the grant market, right? You're a high-quality company now in the grant market. And so we have raised well more than $1 million in grant funding over that time, which has not only kept the team going, but we've actually, we outpaced the grants that we expected to win, and we had to grow the team in order to deliver on some of these grants. So the team size and scaling has actually happened faster more recently because of grants.
That's really interesting and good advice, I think, for people that might be listening that are going through the kind of fundraising rounds at the moment. But as well as being successful on grant raising, you've also award winning as well recently, I believe. You won the Santander X Global Challenge Award. Is that right?
Yes. So as part of the grant writing process, we included prizes of every stripe in there.
Yeah.
And Santander were looking for smart AI companies. We looked at that competition brief and thought, great, that's in our list of things to apply for. And we applied, thought nothing more of it, got an email back a little while later that we'd been shortlisted. Oh, great. What did we apply for? And then, grant writing and prize writing and things like that, it's very much a numbers game. You apply for a lot of things. You try and make sure that you screen for the many opportunities that are out there, for the ones that match you and your business. This one seemed to match us. Clearly, we were the sort of thing that they wanted. We went through the second phase, and ultimately we won this. We were one of the startup winners that they flew out to San Francisco for an award ceremony at Microsoft's offices out there. Came with a nice cash prize, which is always good in this environment, and also a lot of support from many stakeholders that they've engaged, such as Microsoft and other partners. And having a bank in there was, no bad thing, again, in this environment. So yes, that's been great, and it's it's part of a strategy of looking at where you can get even modest amounts of funding add up if you're fairly careful to make sure that you balance the amount of time taken to apply for each opportunity against its likely outcome. It's just an optimization problem.
Yeah, and that kind of touches on the follow-up question. I mean, I think some people are a little bit cynical towards things like awards and entering awards, but it sounds like you've taken a very calculated approach in terms of, as you say, finding awards that might be appropriate to you, but you're clear about the benefits of winning. Like, it might be cash, it might be connection and networking or access to partnerships. It might be the brand awareness and the validation of what you're doing from a third party. It's probably all of those things. But I think for people that are listening that are cynical towards awards, would you encourage people to take them more seriously?
So you've got to be very clear about what you're doing this for. Some companies need awards for PR purposes. Now, our last company was a direct-to-consumer healthcare product in the fertility space. And that was driven, sales were driven by exposure in the media. And so in that company, we spent a good deal of time looking at PR opportunities, and awards were part of that as well. And that was for the business purpose of making sales. This company, we don't make sales. We don't sell into the NHS. We give them product. They give us data. At the moment. We're going out to the US, where, again, we will be giving devices to patients, and we will hopefully be funded to some extent by the healthcare system to do that as well. But the purpose of the company is not to go and market to patients. So why do we want awards? Occasionally it's useful for investors to see that you've won an award. That's great. Everyone likes to win an award and track a little piece of glass on the shelf, but it's a competitive environment, and people with a stronger competitive need for these things are likely to outcompete you if you are not, quite logical and methodical as to what you're doing.
Yeah.
So think carefully about whether this is right for your company. These things do take a lot of time to apply for.
And to manage when you have them. Because
yes,
some of them come with, this meeting there and that conference there, and they fly you to this place, which is great if you want to make those connections, if you do have plans to make the most of them. But if you're just going along because you just wanted that award, that's not a great use of time.
No, that's a good point.
And there are dozens and dozens of awards out there, right? It's a case of screening them early to see about the fit and why you want it, then applying with the appropriate amount of time put into the application process, right? You can massively overdo that, and then, you're effectively wasting your resource. Although you might win it and you'll be like, oh, wait, we won it, right? If you keep following that process many, many times over, which you have to do, then you will ultimately end up losing. So, be careful, but absolutely worth doing for the right business reasons. Just be clear about why.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you both for your time. What's next? What's your sign off on this podcast?
The big thing that's coming up for us now, we've just won another big grant to fund a clinical study of our devices with GP groups, pharmacists and patients in the home in the NHS. And literally tonight we're off to go and pitch to our investors for the required matched funding for that. A lot of these grants require you to match fund for it. So hopefully in a fairly short period of time, we will convince our investors to open their wallets and get yet another grant underway and be helping literally hundreds more NHS patients who have poorly managed heart failure.
That's great, and we'll be tracking your progress closely, and we hope to be sharing that good news on the podcast in future weeks.
Thank you very much.
Today's show was produced by Carl Homer of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner, Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It will really help others discover the show.
Cambridge United Foundation is the charitable arm of Cambridge United Football Club. We utilise the power of sport to improve people's lives in our community. We run a range of sessions working with different groups, from older adults to school children, and for anyone who might not have equal access to sport and activity. To find out more about what we do, visit cufcfoundation.com.